Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Maddie Dalrymple. I write the Ann Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts and the Lizzie Ballard thrillers, and I also write, speak, podcast, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the Indy Author. And you can find out more about me at MaddieDalrymple.com and at theindyauthor.com. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask authors 2 questions related to their latest book. What did they learn from that book that they would like to share with their fellow writers? And what did they learn from that book that they would like to share with their fellow readers? And I am here today with Doug Smith. Hey, Doug, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Maddie. Thanks for having me on.
It is my pleasure. To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, Douglas Smith is a multi-award winning author described by Library Journal as one of Canada's most original writers of speculative fiction. His books include the urban fantasy novel The Wolf at the End of the World, the collections CHIMERASCOPE and IMPOSSIBILIA, and the writer's guide Playing the Short Game, How to Market and Sell Short Fiction. And in fact, Doug was my guest on the Indy Author Podcast to discuss that topic in episode 79, Making the Most of Your Short Fiction. Doug is the 4-time winner of Canada's Aurora Award, most recently in 2023 for The Hollow Boys for Best YA Novel, and that book also won the juried Indy Author Project Award. And his latest work is the award-winning YA urban fantasy trilogy, The Dream Rider Saga, The Hollow Boys, The Crystal Key, and The Lost Expedition. And so today I am asking Doug the 2 What I Learned questions about The Lost Expedition, starting with, what did you learn from that book that you would like to share with your fellow writers?
Yeah, and actually it was a big learning, and I'll have to expand it. It's actually what I learned from writing the trilogy, my first trilogy. When I started out and I began to write The Hollow Boys, the first book, Charles DeLint gave me some excellent advice based on his own experience writing his YA urban fantasy trilogy, the Wildings series, which is great. If there's YA readers out there, maybe you should check it out. He said, write all 3 books before you try to get any of them published. He related how he would have just loved when he was writing book 3 to be able to go back and make changes to book 1 or book 2 or something to really wrap up the series that he wanted to, because you get more ideas and maybe something you set up, you thought properly in book 1, and you get to the final book, and you're going, if I just done that little change, this would be perfect. So that definitely was my big learning. And as I was writing book 2, The Crystal Key, I had this list of changes to make in The Hollow Boys, which was book 1. So I could go ahead and just write book 2 the way I wanted to, knowing I was totally free. I can go back and make changes to book 1 because it wasn't out in the world. It hadn't been published yet. And then in book 3, The Lost Expedition, it was just the same, except I had 2 lists. I had changes to book 1 and changes to book 2. So it was very freeing, because if I came up with just better ideas or a different twist, or in some cases, wow, I just did not set that up correctly, that would not actually work in the ending, I could go back and make the changes in the first 2 books. So yeah, that's my big piece of advice to my fellow writers. If up to then I'd only written like standalone novels and short stories, etc. So this was the first thing that I wrote, which is really one story told over 3 books. Like, it's not a series that is 3 standalone books. It's one big mystery. And I just would have been painting myself into so many corners if I hadn't had that advice from Charles, and it was just great. So if you're a writer out there looking at doing a series, any sort of series, even 2-book series, yeah, write them all before you try to publish any of them.
And over how long a time were you writing them? And then over how long a time did you publish them?
I should have a better answer for knowing how long it took, but I probably, because when I started the series, I was still working at a full-time job. So it probably was to finish all 3 books somewhere in the 5-year range, I would say. And then the publishing process, putting out an ebook and a print edition, both paperback and a hardcover, wasn't that hard or long. I put out the Hollow Boys in October of 22. And then 5 months later, I put out The Crystal Key in March of 23 of this year. So that's another advantage, is that you can get the books out. I could have put them out 1 a week if I wanted to, but I wanted to spread them over 3 different calendar years for things like award possibilities, etc. And then just the matter that you had more time to market the series. So it's a bigger build up to the final book.
Yeah, I think that advice is easy to comply with logistically and difficult to comply with emotionally, because I think it's
Emotionally, yeah.
so hard to have a book that's done, you know,
Yeah.
99.9% done, and then say, "No, I'm just gonna put this aside." Like, the desire is to get it out there and get people reading it right away. Did you
Yeah.
struggle with that at all?
Um, not a little bit because and I had a lot of discussion with writer friends about, okay, what's the optimum time between books? And I got everything from, yeah, just put them all out at once. And you got a huge hit. And versus, no, like spread them out a year apart. And so I finally just went with what I thought was a comfortable separation. It gave me enough time to get the Hollow Boys, the first book, out there with enough hype and publicity, and that people would start to be looking for the second book. And then with the third book, if anything, I probably would have delayed the second book a little bit longer, just a couple of months, because there's 5 months between one and two, and book three is coming out in January, so it's going to be about 9 months since the second book. But no, I still do that, and I think spreading them over 3 calendar years still makes sense for me.
Yeah. I wrote my Lizzie Ballard books. I wrote the first one not knowing whether it was going to be a series. It turned out to be a I think it's going to be a series of trilogies. And there were times when I said, "Oh man, I wish I hadn't done such and such." But so far, I haven't encountered anything that I couldn't work around in a way that was perhaps different than I would have done if I had had the luxury of being able to go back and change the first book. But like different, but not necessarily worse. Like in some cases, I think that the constraints were sort of fun, but of course, if I thought about it, I'm sure I would think of examples where, "Ooh, it would have been even better if I could have gone back and tweaked something
Yeah,
retrospectively."
yeah. No, I can understand that. Yeah, obviously, it can be done. I think most writers probably don't hang on to an entire series and publish it, but I've thanked Charles many times. He's certainly made it less stressful for me and let me put out the story I wanted to tell and actually hung together the way I wanted it to.
Can you give an example of something that you went back and changed as you got to subsequent books that you went back and changed in an earlier book?
Oh, wow. I mean, the setup is that the main protagonist is an orphan. He has some strange superpowers that let him walk in the dream of all of our dreams. But it came with him getting acute agoraphobia. And so he can't actually leave his home. And all this came about from something that happened in an expedition that he was on with his artifact hunting parents. Some call them grave robbers and treasure hunters from 8 years ago. So that's the overall mystery, is what happened 8 years ago to him, and are his parents still alive? Can he ever get cured? Where did his powers come from, etc. So there were some tweaks. When I finally came around to writing a third book, and we're going back to Peru and finding out what happened to him, there were just a lot of things I wanted to set up a little more precisely in the first book to make it work better in the third. Nothing huge, but just little ones that I wanted to make sure someone didn't go back and say, "Well, wait a minute, book one, you said, you know, you
Yeah,
first saw this artifact here, and later on you have it in a different way." So
yeah,
you don't know until you're writing it and you're saying, "Yeah, I want to change that."
yeah. And I have to ask one more question for your fellow writers, and that is, do you promote or plan to promote the second and third books independently, or would you always point readers to the first book to encourage them to read through in order?
You're almost leading into the answer to your second question,
Oh,
but
good.
uh, yeah, um, I do tend to, when in doubt, like if I'm doing a promo or something, I will tend to discount the first book in the series. I don't do free, but I'll knock it down to 99 cents sometimes, or 2.99. But I've done, like when the second book came out, I did a book club on the second book. Did some promos specifically around the second book. And basically, if my feeling is, if someone finds the second book, as you'll find out, they'll quickly learn they need to read the first book first. It still pays off. So if someone wants to get the first book or the second book, they'll probably get the first one as well. But yeah, I did some promotion, but now with the third book coming out, I've got some release day promotions around it. But I also have a couple of first book promos coming up in December and January prior to the book three coming out.
Yeah, I guess if one is explicit enough about a book being the second or third in a series like that, a series with an overarching arc, then people can self-select. Like, I think some people absolutely want to read them in order, and some people don't care. I'm in the I don't care category. But if you're clear enough about it, then it's kind of on them to know whether they're going to be happy starting with book two or book three, and maybe going back later to book one.
Yeah.
Any other lessons? You said we kind of started in on the lessons that you'd like to share with your fellow readers. Any others that you came up with from the Lost Expedition?
For the readers, well, I'll be very specific on this one. And you mentioned, being explicit to your readers about the reading order. If you pick up book two or book three, I think on the second page, you get a single page of how to read this series. And the short answer at the very first line is in order, please. And then I go on to explain that this is one big mystery. It just happens to be told, broken into three books, but is one big mystery. And if you jump into book two or book three even worse, you're just going to be confused and you're going to be disappointed. And I don't want disappointed readers. So please don't do that. So yeah, that's my advice to readers is when you're looking at a series, like maybe do some Googling, read what the author has to say about them, because some of them are just jump in the middle. You're in that universe, but it's a standalone story. This is not a standalone story. These are all tied together, and book two picks up immediately after book one, and book three the same for after book two. And I do callbacks, sort of memory refreshers for people who have read the books in order, so they can say, "Oh yeah, that's what his powers are. That's what her powers are." I remember them using that, but I don't explicitly explain how they got them or how they work, etc. It's just sort of a memory aid for people, assuming they've read the previous books.
Yeah, I think that that is one of the most difficult things about writing a series is knowing how much to provide so people who are jumping in, and this would be more for a series where they're kind of standalone.
Yeah,
You're not necessarily encouraging people to go to the first one, giving them enough that they can tell enough about what happened before, but not boring the people who have read it, or also accommodating the people who've read the first ones. But maybe it hasn't been for 3 years, so they don't really remember
yeah.
anything.
There's
It's
that
very
exactly.
tough.
I
Do
mean,
you
I
have
used
any
to.
tips for like how to do that?
So I have a writers group and have some good beta readers and ask them that specific question, like, because my writing group would have got all the novels about 3 chapter chunks at a time, 3 to 5 chapter chunks. And a lot of times they couldn't even remember, what happened in the first part of the book that they're still critiquing. The beta reader is probably a better test because they would have been about a half year between reading book one to book two to book three, etc. So, one of the things I asked them was, please tell me, do I need more callbacks? Do I need more explanation? Did you forget how this worked or that worked? Or do you think I just need a bit more detail to tweak the reader's memory? And there was a couple of times you get different answers. You get one beta and no, I'm fine. Everything was great. And the other one saying, no, I really need a bit more, a reminder of how that works and what they can do and what they can't do with their powers, etc. So that's my best advice. I tend to err on the side of under explaining. I'd rather have my readers or my beta readers come back and say, I need a bit more here, as opposed to erring on the side where I'm boring people who fully remember what that was and they don't need all the details.
Yeah.
Plus, I'm always looking for a place to cut words, so that's another reason.
I was wondering if you ever thought about having the story you wanted to tell be one longer work, or was it always going to be three separate books?
But do you mean could I have told this story in one single book?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely no way. I was at one point, this trilogy almost became a trilogy in 4 parts because the third book is about a third again as long as either of the first 2 books. But I think that's good. I actually talked to a lot of my writer friends. I said, look, I can put out the ending to this series in 2 books that are probably about 90,000 words each, or I can put out one, which is probably going to be about 160,000 words. What do you think? And it was pretty unanimous. I like, no, don't do that. The third book, then the first half of what is the third book now, would have ended on a cliffhanger. And they said, no, your readers are not going to appreciate that. The first two books they're standalone stories, like what happens, the baddies that they're fighting, the problems that they're facing, and each of those books wrap up by the end of that book, but each of them build on the overall mystery. I wouldn't have had that option if I'd split the third book into two. So a single book, no, that would have been just absolutely, I mean, you would have needed a hand cart to move the print edition around. And I think there's an advantage to doing it as a series. I mean, it just brings sell-on work to the next next volume in the series too. So mine, if I'd done that, mine would have been 750, almost 1,200 pages.
Yeah. Breaking them up
So,
was the right move.
yeah,
So is
that
the
would have
story
been
wrapped
big.
up with the Lost Expedition, or are there going to be more stories with this cast of characters?
Well, I like your thought about, maybe you'll have a series of trilogies. I think if I come back to these characters, I'd start something new. And just knowing the way I tend to write now, my stories tend to be long. So I might come up with a one-off book for these characters. But yeah, the Lost Expedition wraps up all the questions that you have over the first three books. I don't leave anything hanging. And I do have sort of where they might go in their next journeys, but everything is wrapped up for them and no questions are left unanswered. But I'm probably not going to come back to these characters for a while. I've been promising a lot of people I'd write the next book in my Heroica series, the sequel to The Wolf at the End of the World. So I'm planning to do that. I'll start on that fairly shortly.
Right. Well, I myself am super intrigued by the Dream Rider Saga, ending with the Lost Expedition. And Doug, thanks so much for talking with me. Please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and your books and everything you do online.
Thank you again for having me on, Maddie. Easiest thing is just go to my website, which is Smith Writer, all one word, smithwriter.com. And you'll find all my books, my bios, reviews, whatever, my blog, etc. So best place to start. And books are available at all major retailers in both ebook and paperback and hardcover.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Maddie.